All right, so yeah, my name's Alice Boxhall, and I'm talking about debugging accessibility. So this is not a talk about testing. Hopefully, many of you have used accessibility testing tools before, or if not, you'll start searching the web for it after this and find out about those, because there's a lot of good ones. I wrote one. I'm not saying that it's the best. There are other great ones. So testing rocks. Testing really does rock. But there's always a debugging step, like the why doesn't this work, or how does this work? I live my entire life in the JavaScript console in Chrome, like WTF. Trying to figure out, okay, yeah, for a non-compiled language like JavaScript, catching typos is like, oh, really? Did I write that? That was stupid. Also, trying to figure out how the code hangs together, just sort of interacting with it and getting a sense for how it all works, whether it was code that someone else on the team wrote and I'm trying to hook into it, or if it's code that I wrote 3 months ago and now just don't remember how it works anymore. And to some extent, we debug CSS as well. And again, this is Chrome DevTools. So looking at where does this style come from, or learning about how CSS works and what overrides and what inherits, and how things all hang together. But also debugging, where did that float come from, or why do I have a margin on this that I didn't set? So debugging is something that, activity that as developers we're going to perform as often as possible. And as soon as we have a debugging tool available, it just sort of opens up the world to us a bit. For accessibility, the story is really kind of piecemeal at the moment. So who's actually debugged the accessibility of their application before? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, maybe 10. And what you would have found is that it requires some pretty deep knowledge, and it's pretty tough to find information on it. So I've got a screenshot here of the Accessibility Inspector on Mac, which is a really great tool for inspecting the accessibility tree. So another show of hands, who knows what the accessibility tree even is? It's the same people, basically. So yeah, the accessibility tree is a really important concept in accessibility. It's what assistive technologies actually interact with. So when you've got, it doesn't matter if it's a web application or a native application, they both create this accessibility tree, which then assistive technologies, screen readers, braille displays, doesn't matter, are going to hook into that and interact with the semantic version of the application. So you can draw a button on the screen, and just like it doesn't, it's not going to do anything unless you put a click handler on it. It's just going to look pretty. If you don't actually mark it up semantically, you can well imagine that an assistive technology is going to, it's just a div. It's not doing anything useful. So the accessibility tree is the semantics of the application. All right. So tools like this allow us to actually look at that accessibility tree. But this is per platform. It's you've actually got to install Xcode to get this thing. On Windows, the story's even more obscure. You've got to find these third-party applications that people have written that are sort of varying degrees of maintained. It's quite specialized knowledge, and knowledge that it's sort of pretty unreasonable to expect most the mainstream developers to kind of go and dig up. As front-end developers, we've got enough on our plates to kind of learn and keep on top of without having to go and find out about someone's accessibility tree viewer that they wrote once in 1993. So another thing that we look at, so similarly, even just trying to find out what labels things are getting. So this is a custom element radio button. And there's I can see at least 2, potentially 3 different potential labels that it might have, or at least label sources. And I know what it's going to say because I've actually internalized this thing, the text alternative computation spec. But this is actually my full-time job. It is not your full-time job, and you should not have to do that. It was bad enough for me. So, all right. Color contrast is another one that we come across a lot. So, you might have run some accessibility testing tool on your page and it's gone, hey, this text is low contrast. And then what do? You've got to sort of copy that hex code into another tool. Like this is a screenshot of the very nice WebAIM color contrast checker. So you've got to actually manually go. You've got to know that this thing exists. You've got to know how to use it. You've got to put your colors into it. You've got to know what this number means. And then to try and actually pick a color that is going to be correct, you've got to, this one's actually really nice. It gives you these lighten and darken buttons. But a lot of them will just, they'll tell you the color contrast ratio. So there's all of these things kind of all over the place that all require, quite a lot of specialized knowledge to use. So what I consider my full-time job at the moment is to make accessibility as touchable as something like a JavaScript program or CSS or the HTML DOM, which I didn't talk to, but obviously I'm looking at that DOM viewer all the time as well. So what does that entail? All right. So first of all, I wrote the Accessibility Developer Tools extension. Has anyone used that? Yay, thank you. I think it's pretty good. So if you've used it, you've probably used the accessibility audit, which is one of those accessibility testing tools that I talked about. What I feel like, I don't have numbers on this, but I feel like at least 90% of people who have used it have never seen this thing, which is really sad. It's really undiscoverable, so I'm really sorry about that. But if you go into the Elements panel and the same little sidebar where the styles information is, if you hit that little double right chevron, it'll come up. And then there's an accessibility properties pane that comes up that's got all this, I think, really useful information in it. So it gives you some ARIA information. It allows you to debug those color contrast issues. It gives you some information about focus and visibility. So a problem that often comes up is something is focusable, but it's behind a modal dialog or something, and that's a real problem. So trying to debug those issues. And also the computer label for the element. All right, so taking each of those areas in turn. Yeah, this is the ARIA spec. I've internalized that as well. It's my job. Sucks. All right, so this is what the accessibility properties pane looks like when I'm looking at this nice Polymer custom element. It has a roll of menu, which is great. It's working. It's doing its job. So yeah, hang on. If I say roll, do most people what's she talking about? Who does not know what I mean when I say roll? Cool. All right, I'll explain that. So, all right, if I say ARIA, who's with me on that? Who's not with me on that? That's a more useful number. All right, cool. I'll explain ARIA. So I was talking about the semantic tree before, which is what assistive technologies look at and interact with. If you create something like a custom element or even just a fancy button style div kind of thing where you do everything yourself, you manually add all the event listeners, a screen reader, for example, is not going to know what that is unless you give it a semantic role. So ARIA is the technology that allows us to actually specify those semantics manually rather than just having the inherent semantics of native HTML elements like native buttons and so on. So what we've got here is this custom element has a role attribute, which is going to say to a screen reader, even though this looks like a div to you, treat it as a menu. So that's basically the role of ARIA. And this accessibility properties pane is telling us, okay, this has got a role of menu, which is a correct and useful ARIA role. We've tried to specify this thing called ARIA active descendant, which is another type of ARIA attribute which lets you say, this child of mine gets focus if I get focus. So it's like saying, even though the browser focuses on the core menu, the actual pretend that the focus is on this item. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to specify that, but instead of giving an ID ref, we've given it a selector string, which seems like it should work. And without debugging tools, the only way to actually find out that this hasn't worked is to go and try this in a screen reader or in some other kind of assistive technology, and then maybe it doesn't work, but then you're like, okay, is that a browser bug? Is it a screen reader bug? Or did I just do the markup wrong? So this can at least make you sort of give you the information that, okay, you've done the markup right. So then if we go and fix that, it's going to get rid of that nice little warning logo and give us a clickable link to the element that it's actually marked as the active descendant. So in this case, if we go to that active descendant element, we've tried to give it a role of item, which is not actually a valid ARIA role. And again, the ARIA spec is kind of almost like its own programming language, but unlike other programming languages, there's no way to debug it currently. There's no way to find out if you've actually written conformant ARIA properties. So this is kind of trying to head towards that to make it actually possible to write this without having to internalize that whole crazy graph like I have. So in this case, yeah, we've tried to give it a role of item, which is not a valid ARIA role. So unfortunately, it doesn't help you. It doesn't sort of like say, did you mean blah? It's not that sophisticated. But once you've gone and looked up the correct role, which is list item, yeah, it's going to tell you that you've done it right. Yay. The other thing it can do is tell you another part of the ARIA spec is if you give something a role that has certain properties normally associated with it. So in this case, we've got a slider, like a HTML range, that's going to need a min, max, and current value. So if you haven't specified those, it's going to tell you about that as well. All right. So what I'm working on currently is a new experiment in Chrome DevTools, which is going to allow you to actually access the browser's idea of what the accessibility tree is. So the way this works is when you try to run when you run a screen reader on the browser. So my friends who are full-time screen readers know all about this. The browser takes the DOM tree and basically transforms that into this accessibility tree so that screen readers can use it. This experiment allows you to actually see what the browser has done. So rather than the extension, which just sort of looks at the DOM tree and says, okay, this is what I think the browser's going to do, this is the browser saying, no, this is actually what we ended up with. So in this case, we're inspecting a link element. So that's an anchor tag, obviously. And it's telling us that the browser has computed some text saying DOM mutation observers and given it a role of link. So this is obviously you can have an ARIA role, which is explicitly specifying what it should be, but things have their own implicit inherent semantics, and this is exposing that. So you can turn that on by going to Chrome Flags, turning on DevTools experiments, relaunching the browser, opening up DevTools, going to settings, going to experiments, and turning on the accessibility inspection experiment. You'll get the best experience if you do this in Chrome Canary, because then obviously, as I'm submitting changes, you'll get to see the latest and greatest. And I'm going to give a preview of some of that in a moment. All right. So yeah, once again, we're looking at an element, this core menu element that we've given a role of menu. And we're seeing again that, yes, the role has been computed as menu. And in this case, we've actually specified the active descendant correctly, and we're getting a nice little link there. And once again, it also picks up those implicit inherent semantics in native HTML elements. So that's one thing the extension doesn't do. All right, so onto color. So in Accessibility Developer Tools extension, we have this really, in my opinion, nice contrast ratio debugging interface, which gives you the computed contrast ratio for the element you're inspecting based on its idea of the background color. So it's a little bit interesting when you've got things like images or absolute positioned elements, but otherwise it's gonna walk up the tree and flatten the background color for you, and compute the contrast ratio. But what it also does is suggest some colors that you could use instead. So it tries to pick a color which is close to the color you're originally using, and then you can actually click on these little squares and say, okay, how's that gonna look in my page if I actually use that color? In DevTools, where we actually added a separate experiment for a contrast ratio line in the color picker. So the idea will be once you open the color picker on an element that has some text in it, you'll see this nice kind of curved line telling you, okay, if you're on one side of the line, you'll be low contrast. If you're on the other side of the line, you'll have sufficient contrast. So hopefully this is going to end the epidemic of low contrast text on websites, because I don't know about you, but I'm so over it. I'm so over not being able to read text on my phone. Yeah. So this is coming. It's in progress. We're still working on exactly what the UI is going to look like. For example, how do you tell which side of the line you need to be on? And we're going to have some UI to sort of like give you a bit more information, like what's the numerical value of that contrast ratio, and if it's low, give you a little warning icon, that kind of thing. Oh yeah, and it looks really cool when you move the sliders. Ooh, I could watch that all day. All right, but I won't. All right, so I've touched on text computation a couple of times already, and yeah. So we've got in the extension, it does its best. So I actually sort of rewrote that whole text computation algorithm in JavaScript for the extension so that it can actually tell you. So the text can come from sort of multiple sources for each given element. There's like a whole sort of hierarchy. So in this case, we've got an element where it has a content. It's like its text content is filters, but we've also added a redundant ARIA label. And then we also tried to add an ARIA labeled by, which allows me to specify another element. Woohoo, I stepped on a cord. All right, it's all good. Allows you to specify another element to act as the text content of this element. Unfortunately, in this case, I've given it an ID ref to an element that doesn't exist. So yeah, so we end up with the second option, which is filters. So in the experiment, and this is a works on my machine special right now because it's still actually in review, but I'm really, really excited about it. It's going to actually, now as the browser is computing the text that will be sent to assistive technology in the accessibility tree, it goes through and collects all of the potential sources and then it'll present them to you. So this is actually based on what the browser has done to compute the text. So I'm pretty excited about that. So in this case, we've got an element that has an ARIA labeled by, so again, being able to specify one or more elements to act as the text. And in the middle, I've put in an ID ref to an element that doesn't exist, but it doesn't matter. I still get some useful text there. So it allows you to sort of debug the text computation for your element, and also see if you're actually specifying redundant labels, which I see constantly. Sort of people panic and try to put all these different types of labels and everything to really make sure that the label gets on there, but then you end up with like 5 different potential labels for an element. And yeah, so this is this is an older version of the UI before I kind of changed my mind about how I wanted it to look. But this is again showing that different certain types of labeling will override other ones. All right, focus. So to be honest, I haven't really come up with a good solution for how to debug focus issues. I have some ideas, but I would love to hear sort of what people want when we get to the Q&A. I have some ideas about what I want, but it would be great to hear sort of like, if only the browser did blah. So right now in the extension, it's going to tell you if something has a tab index, and if it's one big problem that we see is if something has a tab index but it's not visible, it can create a pretty confusing experience if you're trying to use a keyboard to go through the page. So we try and give you, like, if it's not visible, explain why. And then you can also hide things from the accessibility tree, so it'll tell you if you've done that as well. So yeah, as I said, in the experiment, haven't implemented anything yet. One thing I think would be cool is if we can sync the inspected element, or like have a toggle to sync the inspected element in DevTools to document.active element, so you can actually watch focus move through the page in the inspector. I think that would be awesome. All right, so once again, the accessibility tree. So yeah, so we've got we're exposing the name and the ARIA equivalent attributes. So role, in this case, role description, checked selected for this, what is it? It's an option. Oh yeah, menu option. So it's pretty minimal. It's just going to tell you about the node that you're currently looking at. So one thing that we do in the accessibility tree is we actually prune out a lot of the nodes in the DOM tree. So things like divs that are just there for sort of presentational reasons to kind of get something like into a particular part of the page or to get a particular style on it. We're going to strip all of those out. So it helps you. This is going to help you debug if something is actually not showing up in the accessibility that should be. It's going to actually help you figure out what's going on there. So one example is if something's not rendered. So in this case, it's probably, yeah, it's got a display none style on it. If something is used as a label for something else, that also doesn't make it into the tree. So in this case, it's kind of neat. I can go, okay, this says option 1, not in the accessibility tree, but the thing that it labels is, and that thing will get this as a text alternative. And if we've used, as I mentioned, you can actually hide things from the accessibility tree. So ARIA hidden is going to say, okay, accessibility tree doesn't get this at all. So for example, if you've got a responsive menu that only shows up at certain sizes, you'd want to actually hide that from accessibility because it's not showing on screen. It's going to be a really confusing experience if you're using a screen reader, and you might actually have like a wide menu and a narrow, like a slide-in menu. You don't want to have them both there. For screen readers, it's going to be like you're going to have to go through the whole menu twice. So you do want to hide it in that case, but other times you might have actually put ARIA hidden on something that you didn't mean to. So yeah, this allows you to debug that. And yeah, as I mentioned, there's just a whole bunch of nodes that we prune out of the tree. So this is kind of the catch-all. It's like, well, it's not interesting. It's not doing anything. It doesn't have a role. It's not focusable. Doesn't have any text. Yeah, we're not interested in that. What I would like to eventually do is, so I showed at the start that little accessibility, Mac accessibility inspector thing. I want to replace that. I want to have, like we have for the DOM tree, have a fully inspectable view of the accessibility tree, which is going to allow you to sort of actually see how it all works. I guess this is trying to make accessibility something that, developers that haven't spent the last 4 years learning about accessibility can actually figure out and learn about for themselves. Maybe side by side with the DOM tree. I'm kind of leaning away from that now. I don't think we need to do that. But also allow you to interactively filter that tree by focusability. So just show me the focusable elements, and that'll give me the tab order of the page. Let me filter by role or abstract role. So one thing that screen readers can do is actually jump around by heading or by link or by landmark. So if I can filter the tree by those things, I can actually see what the screen reader is going to be able to actually access, for example. Okay, that's the end of the main bit of my talk, but I did want to give a plug. If you do want to learn more about accessibility and meet some really badass accessibility experts, the Bay Area Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup meets regularly. You can find it at the A11Y Bay Meetup. Jennison, the organizer, is in the audience somewhere, but I don't see him. There he is, in the back in the lime green shirt. He's a sharp dresser. He's a great guy. Definitely try and grab him if you're interested in that at all. It's a really, I go pretty regularly. It's a really great group. And that is probably the end, unless anyone wants to learn more about the color contrast, color suggestions. All right, that's so few of you that maybe we'll just talk about it later on. All right, well, thank you very much for listening.